The winter of 1817 was particularly brutal in England's northern counties. Snow had fallen for days, blanketing the Yorkshire moors in pristine white that quickly turned treacherous as temperatures plummeted further. Even the wealthiest estates struggled to keep their halls warm, while in the surrounding villages the poor huddled together, praying for survival until spring. It was on the coldest night of January that the Duke of Thornfield found himself travelling through this desolate landscape. Alexander James Huntington, the sixth Duke of Thornfield, was not a man accustomed to discomfort. At 35, he commanded one of the largest fortunes in England, with properties scattered across 3 counties and investments that stretched to the colonies. Tall and imposing, with features too sharp to be handsome but striking nonetheless, he was known throughout society for his exacting standards and formidable temperament. "Your Grace," his driver called down from the box, voice nearly lost in the howling wind, "the road ahead is becoming impassable. Thornfield Hall is still 5 miles distant." The Duke frowned, peering through the carriage window at the whirling snow. "Is there shelter nearby?" "The village of Millfield lies just beyond that rise, Your Grace. They have a small inn." Alexander sighed in irritation. This journey had already taken far longer than anticipated. He had been summoned to London for urgent business with his solicitors, matters that could not be entrusted to correspondence, only to find the situation less dire than reported. Now, eager to return to the solitude of Thornfield Hall, he faced yet another delay. Very well, make for Millfield. The carriage lurched forward, horses struggling through snowdrifts that reached their knees. Alexander braced himself against the swaying vehicle, his mood darkening with each passing minute. The urgent business that had called him to London had been troubling enough, issues with his ward's inheritance that required his personal attention. Eleanor, his late cousin's daughter, had been left in his care 5 years ago, an unwanted responsibility he had delegated primarily to governesses and tutors at Thornfield Hall while he travelled between his properties. The girl would soon turn 18, at which point her considerable fortune would transfer to her control, or to her husband's, should she marry. The legal complications surrounding this inheritance had occupied his thoughts throughout the journey, leaving him distracted and irritable. When the carriage finally slowed, approaching what appeared to be the outskirts of a modest village, Alexander was relieved at the prospect of a fire and hot meal, however humble they might be. But the carriage did not continue toward the village lights. Instead, it halted abruptly beside a stone wall topped with iron spikes, the boundary of what appeared to be an institutional building of some sort. "Why have we stopped?" Alexander demanded, opening the carriage door to address his driver directly. The man pointed toward 2 small figures huddled against the gate. "There, Your Grace, children by the look of them." In this weather, Alexander narrowed his eyes, focusing on the shapes barely visible through the swirling snow. Indeed, 2 small figures were pressed against the locked gates of what he now recognized as St. Agnes Orphan Asylum, a charity institution supported in part by his own family's obligatory donations. "They'll freeze to death before morning," the driver said, his northern accent thickening with concern. Alexander hesitated. He was not known for charitable impulses or particular fondness for children. His substantial donations to various causes were made out of duty to his position, not compassion. Yet even he could not simply drive past children facing certain death. "Wait here," he commanded, stepping down from the carriage. The snow crunched beneath his polished boots as he approached the gates. As he drew closer, he could see that the figures were 2 young girls, neither appearing older than 7 or 8. They were pitifully dressed for the weather, with thin shawls pulled over threadbare dresses and no gloves or proper boots. The smaller child appeared to be unconscious, slumped against the larger girl, who was desperately pulling the bell cord beside the gate. "No one's coming," Alexander stated flatly, causing the conscious child to startle and turn toward him. Her face, though smudged with dirt and tears, struck him immediately. An unusual face for a child, with large, serious grey eyes that seemed to hold knowledge beyond her years. Despite her obvious terror, she straightened her back and moved protectively in front of the smaller girl. "Please, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady for one so young and distressed. "Can you help?" "My sister?" "They've locked the gates for the night, but Emma is very sick." Alexander glanced at the smaller child, Emma, noting her flushed face and labored breathing. "Why are you outside the gates? Are you not residents here?" He gestured toward the asylum building, where only a single light burned in what appeared to be a porter's lodge. "We were," the girl explained, her composure cracking slightly. "But Mrs. Bates sent us to the village with a message this morning. When we returned, the gates were locked, and no one answers the bell. I think they've forgotten us, or—" She stopped abruptly as though afraid to voice her real suspicion. "Or deliberately left you out here," Alexander finished for her, familiar enough with the cruelties that could occur in such institutions. While some were run by genuinely charitable souls, others were merely warehouses for unwanted children, operated by those who saw their charges as burdens rather than responsibilities. The girl nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face, assessing him with a wariness that spoke of hard-learned lessons about trusting adults. "Emma has a cough that keeps the other girls awake. Mrs. Bates said it was becoming a nuisance." Alexander felt an unexpected flash of anger toward this unseen Mrs. Bates. He was a hard man, often cold to those around him, but even he would not condemn a child to freeze for the crime of being ill. "What is your name?" he asked, his tone softer than he had intended. "Charlotte, sir. Charlotte Gray. Emma is my half-sister." Alexander made a swift decision, one that surprised even himself. "My carriage is waiting. I will take you to the inn. In the village, where your sister can receive proper care." Relief flooded Charlotte's face, but was quickly replaced by suspicion. "Why would you help us, sir? You're a gentleman. Gentlemen don't concern themselves with orphans." Her directness, so unusual in a child, almost made Alexander smile. "Perhaps I am not a typical gentleman," he replied, though this was patently untrue. He was, in almost every respect, the epitome of his class, with all its attendant prejudices and privileges. Charlotte studied him for another long moment, before nodding decisively. "Emma needs help right away. She's burning with fever." She hesitated, then added with heartbreaking practicality, "If you mean us harm, at least Emma might live through the night." The calculation in her young voice, weighing her sister's survival against potential danger, stirred something uncomfortable in Alexander's chest. What kind of life had this child lived to make such assessments at her age? "I assure you, Miss Gray, I intend no harm." He removed his heavy outer coat and wrapped it around the unconscious Emma, lifting her easily into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a fact that further fueled his uncharacteristic anger toward those responsible for her care. Charlotte remained rooted to the spot, watching him with uncertainty. "Come," Alexander commanded, using the same tone that ensured immediate obedience from his servants. "There isn't time to waste." To his mild surprise, Charlotte followed, though she maintained a careful distance as they approached his carriage. The driver's eyes widened at the sight of his master, carrying a child, but he quickly recovered, jumping down to open the carriage door. "To the village inn, at once," Alexander ordered, placing Emma gently on the carriage seat before turning to help Charlotte. The girl hesitated at the carriage step, looking up at him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "Can you take her instead of me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "There might not be room for us both, and Emma needs help more." Alexander said nothing for a long moment, struck speechless by this selfless request from a child who had clearly received so little kindness herself. Then, without a word, he lifted Charlotte into the carriage and climbed in after her, closing the door firmly against the bitter cold. "There is room enough for both of you," he said as the carriage lurched forward, "and I will see to it that you both receive whatever care you require." Charlotte didn't reply, but she moved closer to her sister, placing a small hand on Emma's forehead with tender concern. For the first time, in the muted light of the carriage lantern, Alexander noticed a bruise shadowing the side of Charlotte's face. Evidence that neglect was not the only mistreatment the girls had suffered. The journey to the village took less than 15 minutes, but during that time, Alexander found himself observing Charlotte with growing curiosity. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she remained vigilant, dividing her attention between her sister's condition and their unexpected benefactor. When Emma whimpered in her fever-induced sleep, Charlotte whispered soothing words with the practiced ease of a caretaker far beyond her years. The Millfield Inn was a modest establishment, but the only one the small village boasted. As the Duke's grand carriage pulled up outside, lights appeared in windows, and the innkeeper himself hurried out, astonishment evident on his weathered face. "Good evening, sir," he began, before noticing Alexander's fine attire as he descended from the carriage. The man's demeanor instantly changed. "Your lordship, we weren't expecting, that is, we're honored, but our humble establishment—" "I require your best room immediately," Alexander interrupted. "Send for the local physician. These children need urgent care." The innkeeper glanced at the girls as Alexander helped Charlotte down from the carriage and then lifted Emma into his arms again. His expression shifted from confusion to concerned. "Understanding. Of course, your lordship. We have a good room with a fireplace already lit, and Dr. Wilson lives just across the square. I'll send my boy straight away." Inside, the inn was mercifully warm, with a large fire blazing in the common room hearth. The innkeeper's wife, a plump woman with kind eyes, appeared from the back, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mary, these children need immediate attention," her husband explained rapidly. "His lordship wants our best room prepared." "It's ready now," Mary replied, her gaze taking in the situation with a single sweep. "This way, if you please, sir." She led them up a narrow staircase to a small but clean room where a fire was indeed burning cheerfully. A large four-poster bed dominated the space, with simple but good-quality linens. "I'll bring up hot water and some broth right away," Mary said, turning down the bed covers with efficient movements. "The poor lambs look half-starved as well as frozen." Alexander placed Emma gently on the bed, then turned to find Charlotte standing uncertainly by the door, as though afraid to enter. "Come, Miss Grey," he said, gesturing her forward. "This room is for you and your sister." Charlotte took a tentative step inside. "Are you a lord, sir? The innkeeper called you your lordship." Alexander considered how to respond. He rarely encountered people who didn't already know exactly who he was, with all the fear and deference his title commanded. "I am the Duke of Thornfield," he admitted, watching her face carefully for reaction. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, but she showed none of the awe or intimidation he might have expected. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully, as if this information merely confirmed a theory she had been developing. "That explains the very grand carriage," she said matter-of-factly, "and why the innkeeper is so nervous." Despite the gravity of the situation, Alexander felt his lips twitch toward a smile. Indeed, Mary returned with a basin of steaming water, clean cloths, and a tray bearing 2 bowls of fragrant broth. She set them down and immediately went to Emma, placing a practiced hand on the child's forehead. "She's burning up, poor thing. We need to cool her down and then warm her properly from the inside out." She glanced at Charlotte. "Is this your sister, love?" Charlotte nodded. "Half-sister. Her name is Emma. She's 6, I'm 8. And you've been out in that dreadful snow. Where are your parents, child?" "Dead," Charlotte replied simply. "We're from St. Agnes Asylum. They locked us out." Mary's expression hardened momentarily before she forced a smile. Well, you're safe. Now, let's get you both into some warm, dry clothes. I have some things that might fit you. My daughter's outgrown them. Alexander, feeling suddenly out of place in this feminine domain of practical caregiving, stepped toward the door. I shall wait downstairs for the physician. To his surprise, Charlotte darted forward and caught the edge of his coat. You won't leave, will you? You promised to help. The uncertainty in her voice stirred that same uncomfortable feeling in his chest. Children were not typically afraid of him leaving. More often they were relieved when his intimidating presence departed. I will not leave until I'm certain you are both well cared for, he assured her with formal precision. I have given my word. This seemed to satisfy Charlotte, who released his coat and returned to her sister's side. Alexander descended to the common room, where the innkeeper was nervously arranging a table near the fire. Your Grace, if I may be so bold as to have realized your true title, would you care for some refreshment while you wait? We have a good roast beef and a decent claret. Alexander nodded his acceptance, realizing he was indeed hungry after the long, cold journey. As he sat at the prepared table, he found himself oddly distracted, his thoughts returning to the room upstairs, where two orphaned sisters now fought for health and safety. He had never been particularly concerned with the plight of the less fortunate. His charitable donations were made from obligation rather than conviction, and he had always viewed the poor as an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of the natural order. Yet something about Charlotte's direct gaze and selfless concern for her sister had penetrated his carefully maintained indifference. The local physician, Dr. Wilson, arrived as Alexander was finishing his meal, a portly, red-faced man with an air of competent authority. Your Grace, he greeted Alexander with a respectful bow. I understand there are children requiring my attention. Yes, a girl of 6 with high fever, and her older sister who appears exhausted but otherwise physically sound. They were left outside St. Agnes Asylum in the snow. Dr. Wilson's expression darkened. Not the first time I've treated children from that place. The new matron, Mrs. Bates, has a reputation for economy in her management. Economy of food, of coal, of basic human kindness. He collected his medical bag. With your permission, I'll see to them now. Alexander accompanied the doctor upstairs, unwilling to remain below, while decisions were made about the children's welfare. In the room, they found Emma awake, propped against pillows, sipping broth with Mary's assistance. Her fever-bright eyes widened at the sight of the men entering, and she shrank back against the bedding. Charlotte, now dressed in a clean nightgown, many sizes too large for her thin frame, immediately moved to her sister's side. It's all right, Emma. This is the Duke, who rescued us, remember, and the doctor has come to make you better. Dr. Wilson approached with a gentle smile, setting his bag on the bedside table. Hello there, young ladies. Let's see what we can do to have you feeling better, shall we? Alexander watched as the physician examined both girls with thorough professionalism, his jovial manner putting even the frightened Emma at ease. Charlotte answered his questions with precise clarity, detailing her sister's symptoms and their duration with the accuracy of a trained nurse. After his examination, Dr. Wilson stepped aside with Alexander, speaking in low tones. The younger child has a severe chest infection that requires immediate treatment. I've left medicine with instructions for dosage. The older girl shows signs of malnourishment and exhaustion, as well as some concerning bruises that suggest physical mistreatment. Both would benefit from proper nutrition and rest. He hesitated, then added, if they return to St. Agnes in their current condition, I fear particularly for the younger one's survival. Alexander's jaw tightened. They will not be returning to St. Agnes. The words emerged before he had fully considered them, but once spoken, he found he had no desire to retract them. The thought of sending these children back to certain neglect and Possibly death for the younger girl was suddenly inexplicably intolerable. Dr. Wilson looked surprised but relieved. "That is most generous, Your Grace. Might I ask what you intend for them?" It was a reasonable question, and one Alexander had not yet answered for himself. What did he intend? He was hardly suited to care for children personally, and his household, at Thornfield Hall, while well-staffed, was not arranged with young children in mind. His ward Eleanor was nearly grown, and had always had her own governess, and yet "They will accompany me to Thornfield Hall once the younger child is fit to travel," he heard himself say. "I will make suitable arrangements for their care and education." Dr. Wilson's eyebrows rose, but he merely nodded. "A most Christian decision, Your Grace. I shall return tomorrow to check on little Emma's progress. With proper care, she should be well enough to travel within a week." After the doctor's departure, Alexander approached the bed where both girls now sat, Charlotte helping Emma with the last of her broth. Mary had discreetly withdrawn, leaving them alone. "The doctor tells me that you are both in need of extended care," Alexander began formally, unsure how to address children so young. "I have decided that when Emma is sufficiently recovered, you will both accompany me to my estate, Thornfield Hall." Charlotte's spoon halted midway to Emma's mouth. "You're taking us with you, both of us?" "Yes, unless you have objections." Charlotte's eyes narrowed slightly in suspicion. "What would we be at Thornfield Hall? Servants?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He had not considered specific roles for the children, thinking only that they needed proper care and safety. "No, not servants," he said slowly. "You would be wards of my household. You would receive education and proper care until such time as—" He broke off, uncertain himself of the long-term plan. "Until such time as you tire of your charitable impulse and send us elsewhere?" Charlotte finished for him, her young voice carrying a cynicism that no child should possess. Alexander found himself oddly wounded by her assessment. "I am not known for impulsive acts of charity, Miss Grey. When I make a commitment, I honor it." Charlotte studied him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes, seeming to weigh his worth as thoroughly as any society matron evaluating a potential suitor. Finally, she nodded. "Emma needs a proper home," she said simply, as if that decided the matter. "And you?" Alexander found himself asking. "What do you need, Charlotte?" The question appeared to surprise her. She blinked, momentarily at a loss. I need to stay with Emma," she finally said. "We're all each other has." Alexander nodded, understanding this loyalty perfectly. Had he not also once been a child with only a sibling to rely upon? Before. Time and circumstance had driven them apart. He and his brother had shared that same fierce bond. "Then it is settled. You will both come to Thornfield when Emma is well enough to travel." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Rest now. I shall remain at the inn until you are ready to depart." As he closed the door behind him, Alexander was struck by the magnitude of the decision he had just made. He, who lived a carefully ordered life with minimal disruptions, had impulsively taken responsibility for 2 orphaned children. His staff would be astonished, his social circle scandalized, and his solicitors apoplectic at this unauthorized addition to his responsibilities, and yet the image of Charlotte asking him to save her sister instead of herself stayed with him as he descended the stairs. There had been something in that moment, a purity of spirit, a selflessness he rarely encountered in his cynical world of aristocratic privilege, that had moved him to action. For the first time in many years, the Duke of Thornfield had made a decision based not on duty or logic or social expectation, but on something dangerously close to compassion. What consequences this unprecedented action might bring, only time would tell. A week passed before Dr. Wilson declared Emma fit to travel. During this time, Alexander found himself in the unprecedented position of overseeing the care of 2 orphaned children. He sent word to Thornfield Hall, instructing his housekeeper, Mrs. Fairfax, to prepare suitable accommodations in the nursery wing that had stood empty since his own childhood. He also wrote to his solicitor in London, requesting investigation into the legal status of the Grey sisters and the conditions at St. Agnes Asylum. If his suspicions about the institution's mismanagement were confirmed, he intended to use his considerable influence to see it reformed or closed. Each day, Alexander visited the girls' room, ostensibly to monitor Emma's progress, but increasingly drawn by Charlotte's unusual conversational abilities. Unlike most children who were either terrified into silence or babbled nonsense in his presence, Charlotte spoke directly and thoughtfully, asking perceptive questions about Thornfield Hall and his expectations for their future there. "Will we be allowed in the library?" she inquired on the third day, after informing him that she could read quite well despite limited formal instruction. "You read?" Alexander asked, genuinely surprised. Education at charitable institutions was typically rudimentary at best. Charlotte nodded matter-of-factly. "My father taught me before he died. He was a scholar before he lost his position at Oxford. After that, he couldn't find proper employment, which is why we were so poor. But he made sure I could read." This information piqued Alexander's interest. "Your father was an Oxford scholar. In what field?" "Literature and ancient languages," Charlotte replied, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "He translated Greek poetry. But there was a scandal, something to do with his religious views being too radical, and he was dismissed. That's when he met Emma's mother, who was a seamstress. My own mother had died when I was born." The complexity of this family history, delivered in Charlotte's matter-of-fact tone, left Alexander momentarily speechless. He'd assumed the girls came from completely impoverished backgrounds, not from a fallen academic household. "And how did you come to be at St. Agnes?" he asked, genuinely curious now. Charlotte's expression shuttered slightly. "Father died of consumption 2 years ago. Emma's mother tried to keep us, but then she fell ill too. Before she died, she took us to St. Agnes because she had nowhere else to send us." Her voice remained steady, but her small hands clenched in her lap. "She promised someone would come for us, but no one ever did." The simple tragedy of this account affected Alexander more deeply than he cared to admit. He cleared his throat. "To answer your earlier question, yes, you will have access to the library at Thornfield. It is quite extensive, and arrangements will be made for your formal education." Charlotte's face brightened at this, though she quickly controlled her expression back to its usual seriousness. "Thank you, Your Grace. Emma is too young for much book learning yet, but she's very clever with her hands. She can already sew a straight seam." "A useful skill," Alexander acknowledged, "but at 6 she should be concerned primarily with recovery and play." Charlotte looked genuinely perplexed by this concept. Play? The single word, spoken with such confusion, struck Alexander. Forcefully, had these children never been allowed the simple freedom of play? Even his own strict upbringing had included designated periods for recreational activities, deemed necessary for proper physical development. "Yes, Miss Grey. Play. Children's games and activities for enjoyment." Alexander felt oddly uncomfortable explaining this basic concept. "There are extensive grounds at Thornfield that will be available to you both when the weather improves." Charlotte considered this information as seriously as if he had delivered a complex philosophical proposition. "I see, that would be agreeable, especially for Emma. She's never had much opportunity for play." On the morning of their departure, Alexander arranged for the purchase of suitable travelling clothes for both girls, as well as a small trunk of basic necessities. The innkeeper's wife, who had grown quite fond of the sisters during their stay, added a few personal touches: ribbons for their hair and a small rag doll for Emma that the child clutched as if it were made of gold. "You've done a wonderfully Christian thing, Your Grace," Mary told Alexander as he settled his account, adding a generous gratuity for the special care provided. "Those poor lambs needed someone to champion them, and the Lord chose you." Alexander, uncomfortable with any suggestion of divine guidance in his decision-making, merely nodded politely. He was not a particularly religious man, attending church services primarily out of social obligation rather than spiritual conviction. The journey to Thornfield Hall would take most of the day, and Alexander had arranged for regular stops to ensure Emma's comfort. His carriage had been modified with extra cushions and blankets, and a hamper of food had been prepared for refreshment along the way. As they set off, Emma's excitement at her first carriage ride briefly overcame her natural shyness. She knelt on the seat beside Charlotte, peering out the window at the snow-covered landscape with wide-eyed wonder. Charlotte, though more reserved, could not entirely hide her own interest in their surroundings, particularly when they passed through larger towns with their shops and bustling streets. "Have you ever been to London, Your Grace?" she asked during a quiet stretch of their journey. "Frequently," Alexander replied. "I maintain a residence there for the season and for business." "Matters. Is it as large as they say, with buildings taller than trees and more people than can be counted?" "Parts of it are certainly crowded, and some buildings are indeed quite tall. St. Paul's Cathedral, for instance, dominates the skyline." Seeing her genuine curiosity, he added, "Perhaps someday you might see it for yourself." Charlotte's eyes widened momentarily before her practical nature reasserted itself. "That seems unlikely, Your Grace. Orphans rarely travel to London unless they're being sent to workhouses there." Alexander frowned at this bleak assessment. "You are no longer a common orphan, Miss Grey. Your future circumstances will be considerably different from your past ones." This declaration was met with skeptical silence from Charlotte, though Emma, who had been listening quietly, piped up with unexpected boldness. "Will there be other children at Thornfield Hall?" Alexander turned his attention to the younger girl, who immediately blushed at her own temerity. "There is my ward, Miss Eleanor Fairmont, who resides at Thornfield. However, she is 17, nearly a grown woman." "What's a ward?" Emma asked, then quickly added, "I'm sorry if that's a stupid question." "It is not stupid to seek knowledge," Alexander replied with formal precision. "A ward is a person, usually a child, placed under the protection of a guardian when their parents are deceased or unable to care for them. Miss Fairmont is my late cousin's daughter, placed in my guardianship 5 years ago." Charlotte, ever perceptive, asked, "Are we to be your wards as well, then?" Alexander hesitated. He had not considered the legal terminology that would apply to the girl's position. In effect, yes, though the legal formalities would differ somewhat given your circumstances. "Because we're not of gentle birth like your cousin's daughter," Charlotte stated, not as a question but as a simple fact. "Social distinctions exist in our world, Miss Grey. It would be disingenuous of me to pretend otherwise." Alexander found himself oddly reluctant to emphasize the class divide that would inevitably shape the girl's future. However, education and proper upbringing can overcome many initial disadvantages. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "My father said something similar. He believed learning was the only true equalizer between men. That's why he taught me to read, even when we barely had food." The conversation lapsed into silence after this, with Emma eventually falling asleep against her sister's shoulder, exhausted by the excitement and motion. Charlotte maintained her vigilant watch out the window, her expression alternating between wonder at the passing scenery and wariness, as if still expecting to wake from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, if their rescue proved false. As the short winter day began to fade, Alexander noted they were approaching his lands. The carriage, passed through a set of impressive iron gates, and the road wound through extensive parkland, now blanketed in snow. In the distance, Thornfield Hall gradually came into view. A massive stone mansion dating primarily from Tudor times, with various additions from subsequent centuries, creating an imposing, if somewhat architecturally incongruous whole. Charlotte gasped softly as the building emerged from the gathering dusk, its numerous windows glowing with welcoming light. "It's like a castle from a storybook," she whispered, gently waking Emma. "Look, Emma, we've arrived." Emma rubbed her eyes sleepily, then stared in astonishment at the great house looming before them. "Are we really going to live there?" she asked in a hushed voice, as though afraid speaking too loudly might cause the vision to disappear. "For the present," Alexander confirmed, experiencing an unexpected moment of seeing his ancestral home through fresh eyes. Thornfield Hall had always been simply home to him, its grandeur unremarkable through familiarity. Now, observing the awestruck expressions of these children who had never known anything but deprivation, he was reminded of its objectively impressive nature. The carriage circled the gravel drive and came to a halt before the main entrance, where footmen in livery immediately appeared to assist. The massive oak doors opened, spilling golden light onto the snow-covered steps, and a line of servants emerged to greet their master. Alexander descended first, then turned to help the girls down from the carriage. Emma clung to his hand with surprising strength, while Charlotte climbed down independently, her face composed despite the intimidating scene. "Welcome home, Your Grace." Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, greeted him with a curtsy. "I trust your journey was not too arduous in this weather." "Tolerable, Mrs. Fairfax, thank you." Alexander gestured to the children beside him. "These are the Mrs. Grey, Charlotte, and Emma, who will be joining our household as I informed you in my letter. I trust suitable accommodations have been prepared?" "Indeed, Your Grace. The blue suite in the nursery wing has been completely refreshed. Miss Eleanor assisted personally in selecting appropriate furnishings." Mrs. Fairfax turned her attention to the girls, her kindly face softening further. "Welcome to Thornfield Hall, young ladies. I'm Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper. You must be exhausted after your journey. Shall I show you to your rooms directly?" Emma, overwhelmed by the grandeur and the line of unfamiliar faces, pressed closer to Alexander, while Charlotte stepped forward with remarkable composure. "Thank you, Mrs. Fairfax. My sister is still recovering from illness and requires rest." Alexander noted with approval Charlotte's natural dignity. Despite her threadbare background, there was an inherent grace in her manner that many children of noble birth would have envied. "Miss Eleanor has asked to greet you, Your Grace," Mrs. Fairfax continued. "She awaits you in the drawing room." Alexander nodded. "Very well. Please see the Mrs. Grey settled, and ensure they receive a suitable light supper in their rooms. I shall visit them later to confirm all is satisfactory." As the housekeeper led the girls away, Alexander watched Charlotte protectively guide her sister up the grand staircase, one small hand supportively placed on Emma's back. The younger child glanced back once, meeting his gaze with uncertain eyes, before they disappeared from view. The drawing room was warm and elegantly appointed, with a cheerful fire burning in the marble fireplace. Eleanor Fairmont rose as Alexander entered, curtsying gracefully. At 17, she was a striking young woman with auburn hair and delicate features that hinted at the beauty she would fully possess in maturity. "Cousin Alexander," she greeted him with appropriate formality. "Welcome home. I trust your business in London was successfully concluded. It was, though, with an unexpected development along the way." Alexander moved to warm himself by the fire. "I presume Mrs. Fairfax has informed you of our new additions to the household?" Eleanor's eyes brightened with uncharacteristic animation. "Yes, indeed. Orphaned sisters you rescued from dreadful circumstances. It's like something from a novel." Her enthusiasm faltered slightly under Alexander's raised eyebrow. "I mean to say, it was most charitable of you, cousin. I have helped prepare their rooms myself." "So I was informed." Alexander studied his ward thoughtfully. Eleanor was a generally dutiful girl, somewhat reserved by nature, who rarely demonstrated such enthusiasm for anything. "You seem quite interested in these children." Eleanor blushed slightly. "I confess I am. Thornfield can be quiet, especially in winter, and I've never had the opportunity to know younger girls well. Perhaps I might help with their education. I'm nearly finished with my own studies, after all." Alexander considered the request. He had planned to hire a governess for the Grey Sisters, but Eleanor's offer had merit. It would provide her with useful experience in responsibility, and her gentle nature might help the girls adjust to their new circumstances. A reasonable suggestion. "You may assist with their general education and deportment under Mrs. Fairfax's supervision. However, I shall still engage appropriate masters for specific subjects when the time comes." Eleanor's pleased smile suggested he had made the right decision. "Thank you, cousin. I shall endeavour to be a good influence." After dining with Eleanor and discussing various estate matters that had arisen during his absence, Alexander made his way to the nursery wing. It had been years since he had visited this part of the house, and walking the familiar corridor stirred unexpected memories of his own childhood, not all of them pleasant. His father, the 5th Duke, had been a stern disciplinarian who rarely visited his sons except to criticize their failings. The Blue Suite had been thoroughly transformed since Alexander's last visit. Fresh paper adorned the walls, a cheerful pattern of birds and flowers, and the heavy old furniture had been replaced with lighter, more appropriate pieces for young occupants. A connecting door joined a small bedroom, presumably for Charlotte, to a slightly larger one, where he found both girls. They had been bathed and dressed in new nightgowns, their hair neatly brushed and braided. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, looking impossibly small against the grand four-poster, while Charlotte stood nearby, apparently in the middle of telling a story. Both children fell silent when Alexander entered, Emma shrinking back slightly, while Charlotte straightened her spine in that now familiar gesture of determined dignity. "I see you are settled," Alexander observed, standing somewhat awkwardly by the door. He was unaccustomed to bedtime visits, having delegated such domestic moments with Eleanor to her governess. "Yes, Your Grace, everyone has been very kind," Charlotte replied formally. "The rooms are beyond anything we could have imagined." "Is this all for us?" Emma asked in a hushed whisper. "Even the toys?" She gestured toward a shelf where several dolls and a beautifully crafted miniature tea set had been arranged. "Indeed. Miss Eleanor selected those specifically for your enjoyment." Alexander moved further into the room, noting other thoughtful touches. Books appropriate for children, a small writing desk equipped with paper and pencils, a cushioned window seat, overlooking the gardens. "It's like a palace," Emma said with awe, then immediately looked worried. "We won't dirty anything, I promise. We'll be very careful." The child's fear of damaging her surroundings, as if such a transgression might result in expulsion, struck Alexander forcefully. "These rooms and their contents are meant to be used, Miss Emma, not merely preserved. Children are expected to play and learn, which occasionally results in minor damages that can be easily repaired." Emma looked unconvinced, but Charlotte gave her sister a reassuring nod. "His Grace means we needn't be afraid to touch things, Emma. It's different here from St. Agnes." Alexander cleared his throat. "Indeed. Now, I understand you've had supper and are prepared for bed. Is there anything else you require for your comfort?" Charlotte hesitated, then asked carefully, "What are your expectations for tomorrow, Your Grace? Should we rise at a particular hour? Are there duties we should perform?" Again, Alexander was struck by the child's assumption that their presence must be justified through service. "Your only duties at present are to rest, recover your health, and begin to acclimate to your new surroundings. Mrs. Fairfax will acquaint you with the household schedule tomorrow. Miss Eleanor has expressed interest in assisting with your education, which will commence once you are fully settled." "Education," Emma repeated, her eyes widening, "like in a real school. Of a sort, though conducted here rather than at an institution. You will learn reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, and other subjects appropriate to your ages and abilities." Alexander found himself adding, "as well as music, drawing, and proper deportment." Charlotte's expression remained guarded, but a spark of genuine interest lit her grey eyes. "Like gentle-born girls?" "The fundamentals of education remain the same regardless of birth," Alexander replied carefully. "The application of that education may differ according to one's station, but knowledge itself has intrinsic value." This answer seemed to satisfy Charlotte, who nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Your Grace. We are most grateful for this opportunity." The formal gratitude from such a young child struck Alexander as both admirable and somewhat tragic. No 8-year-old should possess such careful self-control or feel compelled to express such adult appreciation. "You are welcome, Miss Grey." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Should you need anything during the night, pull the bell rope beside the bed. A maid will attend you promptly." After bidding the girls good night, Alexander retreated to his study, where he poured himself a generous glass of brandy and settled before the fire to reflect on the day's events. The faces of the Grey sisters lingered in his mind, Charlotte's guarded intelligence and Emma's vulnerable sweetness. What had he committed himself to with this impulsive act of charity? He, a confirmed bachelor with no particular affinity for children, had suddenly assumed responsibility for 2 orphaned girls of common birth. Society would inevitably question his motives, particularly regarding Charlotte, who would one day grow into a young woman under his roof. His reputation for cold correctness would provide some protection against the worst implications, but gossip was inevitable. Yet beneath these practical concerns lay a deeper, more unsettling question. What would become of these children in the long term? Emma, with her sweet nature and pretty face, might eventually be trained for a respectable position as a lady's maid or similar role. But Charlotte, with her unusual intelligence and perceptiveness, presented a more complex challenge. Alexander took a thoughtful sip of his brandy. Perhaps her father's academic background could provide a direction. With proper education, she might become a governess in a good household, a position above mere servitude, but still acceptable for a woman of her background. But even as he contemplated these conventional futures, Alexander felt a strange reluctance. There was something extraordinary about Charlotte Grey, a quality of mind and spirit that seemed to transcend her circumstances. To relegate such potential to the limited options available to lower-class women felt, for some inexplicable reason, like a waste. "You're being sentimental," he chided himself aloud, "an uncharacteristic and unwelcome tendency." Yet as he retired that night, Alexander found himself dwelling not on the practical complications the children would bring to his orderly life, but on the look of wonder on Emma's face when she saw Thornfield Hall, and the momentary spark in Charlotte's eyes at the mention of education. For the first time in many years, the Duke of Thornfield fell asleep contemplating something other than business matters, estate management, or social obligations. Instead, his thoughts were occupied with dolls, storybooks, and the mysterious potential of 2 orphan sisters who had somehow, against all probability, become his responsibility. Whether this unexpected development would prove a blessing or a complication remained to be seen. But for tonight, at least, Alexander was oddly content with his impulsive decision. The girls were safe, warm, and fed at Thornfield Hall, and tomorrow would bring its own challenges and revelations. If you enjoyed this heartwarming tale of unexpected compassion and new beginnings, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories that remind us how a single act of kindness can change lives forever. Our next feature explores how a reclusive lighthouse keeper found healing by adopting 3 shipwrecked siblings during a winter storm. Subscribe now to never miss these uplifting stories that celebrate the extraordinary power of compassion in our ordinary lives.